Hi, I'm Ashley Nutter, and I lead the Twitch ad products team at Amazon. I've been working on digital media products for more than 10 years across both the creator economy and streaming cable. I've worked on content management products, finance and data products, monetization products, and other things. And I've worked on products at every growth stage from pre-product market fit up to billion-dollar scale. So today I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk about leadership in scaling products up. So before we dive in, I just wanted to start with a simple question of what does it mean to scale a product? So the obvious thing here is that scaling a product is the process of growing or adapting to handle an increasing number of customers. And ideally, you're doing that without sacrificing product performance or customer experience. But scaling ultimately isn't just about adding more features. It's about making smart strategic decisions that mean your growth can be sustainable over time. And that's also about being intentional in what you build and how you deliver your product. So today I wanted to talk through some key strategies and best practices for scaling successfully while you continue to keep your vision and also the customer needs at the center of everything you're doing. So scaling can be challenging because it adds complexity, and there's four common obstacles that we can discuss to get in front of. First is prioritizing the core value prop. So as you start to cater to a broader audience, there sometimes can be a tendency to add a bunch of features or potentially shift your focus away from the original problem that you were trying to solve. But with a strong articulation of your core value prop, you can make sure that every decision you make, every feature that you invest in can be aligned with that value proposition. The second part here is building for flexibility. So early in product discovery, there's sometimes a trade-off between launching and learning velocity and getting to market quickly versus designing for scale. But when you fail to think about how systems could grow over time, you might run into delays or potentially bad user experiences down the line. And so one way to plan for this is to think about how can you build your infrastructure in a flexible way so that it can actually change and grow with you over time. So third is keeping your GTM strategy simple. If you're not crisp about the customer segments that you're targeting, ultimately your messaging can get confused or potentially overly complex. And so what you really want to do is one, be strategic about the customer segments that you're expanding to address. Two is focus on the customer problem. And then three is make sure that your GTM motion is actually tailored to the specific segments that you're going after. And then the last piece is scaling the team. So when organizations grow, alignment sometimes breaks down, and that can lead to miscommunication. It can lead to teams working in silos, and ultimately that can mean your decision making gets fragmented. So this all results in team inefficiencies that you can avoid by just being careful about how you're structuring your team, how you're managing stakeholders, and then also how you're designing your processes. So the first focus area I want to discuss here is product discovery. And you might be thinking, doesn't product discovery happen long before you're thinking about scaling something up? But I would actually argue that scaling starts in the product discovery phase because the decisions that you're making this early on will actually lay the foundation for how well your product can grow over time. And you want to build with scalability in mind from day one, because that foresight is actually going to be critical in giving you a product that can handle larger user bases in the future, can have more features and more complex requirements. So in this section, we'll talk about how to consider scalability in product discovery and then set yourself up for smoother process down the line. So laying the foundation for scalability goes as far back as your original opportunity assessment, which is before you would even begin building something. Because when you're evaluating new opportunities, whether it's like entering a new market or developing a new feature, scalability is actually a central factor in that assessment. Because evaluating a product opportunity includes sketching out how big is that opportunity and how maybe you would think about scaling it up. I think inevitably you're going to revisit this opportunity assessment as you learn more and think about how the narrative would change as you incorporate new information. But ultimately, you want to take a long-term view of the market because finding a product market fit means being in a good market with a product that satisfies that market. And a good market is one that is both large enough to justify your investment in that space and also one that's growing over time. So you'll want to think about product infrastructure and design for growth as well to basically figure out what can your current infrastructure support? What kind of investment would it require to really pursue this opportunity and scale? And that factors into sort of the cost benefit analysis of your ultimate recommendation of, is this opportunity really something worth pursuing? Beyond your initial opportunity assessment, the second piece here that I wanted to talk through is having a clear and compelling product vision, because that not only sets the direction for what you're building today, but it also is like the North Star for how your product is going to scale over time. And that really gives you three things. If you have a very clear product vision, you get three things out of it. First, it provides some stability as you go through various phases of growth. Your vision might evolve some as you learn and as you grow and as you incorporate new information, but it's a relatively fixed point on the horizon that your team can focus on and that can stay consistent through various growth phases. And then second, if you have that relatively fixed point and agreement on, what does the long term look like and what are you after, that also gives you a clear filter for decision making. So any new feature or initiative that you might be evaluating, you can look at it through the lens of whether it actually supports that vision and your scalability goals. And if it doesn't, then that's a clear reason to deprioritize that opportunity. And then lastly, if you have a clear decision-making criteria and a focus for the long term, that keeps the team really focused on what to build. So it's not just a statement of where your product is headed. It's actually more of a strategic tool that aligns your team and makes sure that they are building what actually matters and what actually is taking you closer to where you want to be. So given that, if you've got a clear product vision that is going to be a great lens for helping you make strong decisions, that's ultimately going to help you evaluate trade-offs in your roadmap. So thinking about scalability during product discovery is a bit of a balancing act here, because on the one hand, you want to think about the fastest, most lightweight way to test your hypotheses, but you also want to think about how would you support this scaling up if your hypotheses ultimately are validated? And so during discovery, it's totally okay and even necessary, I would argue, to build things that are not going to scale that well, because that's how you get key insights that are going to guide your next steps. So for example, you might manually handle certain processes or create simplified workflows that make you able to iterate quickly, to test things, to learn in the market. And then, for us in ad products, when we test new ad formats, we often will run through setting up campaigns manually. It's not scalable in the long run, but it allows us to determine whether this particular format is going to serve the needs of our advertisers and also be a positive user experience for our streamers and our viewers. And so it's important to recognize that those non-scalable decisions are a necessary part of the process. And the critical piece is just learning when is the right time to transition to investing in those scalable pieces. And this is sort of another balancing act when you think about it, because you don't want to invest in scalability until you have enough conviction in the product opportunity that it's going to scale up. But you also don't want to wait so long that you have a gap in your user experience. So you want to define the right milestones to say, when do we have enough signal to find it worthwhile to invest in that scalable design? Lastly, in discovery, you might also want to think about how you can actually build growth levers into your product itself. And there's a number of different ways you could do that. So first, you could think about shortening the funnel for user acquisition. That means you essentially want to make it as easy as possible for users to use your product and reduce friction wherever you can. Second, you might want to think about supporting scale through automation. So we talked about in the product discovery phase, you might want to use a number of manual processes to validate your hypotheses and to get the signal that you need. But ultimately, you want to be replacing that with automation so that you don't have humans creating bottlenecks in your process and limiting the number of customers that you can serve. You could also think about introducing viral loops. So that's a self-reinforcing cycle where your users are actually helping to spread your product to other potential users and driving growth organically that way. So the key idea here is that each new user contributes to the acquisition of additional users without requiring intervention from your team. And that can actually perpetuate itself into growth. So some examples of viral loops might be referral programs where users have an incentive to invite friends. It might be social sharing features that encourage users to post content. That's something we do on Twitch, where creators can post highlights and post clips to other social channels, or invite only access for new users, things like that. Lastly, you might want to consider how you can use network effects to promote user retention. Your product will benefit from network effects when users get more value from it as it scales up. So the more users you have, the more the users get value from it. And in order to get into that cycle and reach a critical mass, you might want to think about how to import users from other networks as well. So now, because you've been so smart in your product discovery phase and reached product market fit with good ideas about how to scale your product up, now you'll need to consider how your go-to-market strategy is actually going to change as you scale. And the 4 things you're going to want to think about here are: 1, being really intentional about the target segments that you expand to address. 2 would be simplifying your message to make sure, again, that you are really grounded in that core value proposition and how you pitch it to your customers. 3 would be streamlining your GTM processes for scale. So essentially making sure that you're well set up for efficiency and execution. And then lastly, potentially updating your pricing strategy if it makes sense. So digging into those, the first and most important part of developing a GTM strategy for scale would be choosing your target market. And when you return to your original opportunity assessment, you've definitely answered the question of what is the customer problem and who is the customer. And so ideally, you've defined your customer number 1 very narrowly to say, we are building a product that is going to be absolutely loved by this particular customer. And as you scale up, you might start to think about expanding that beyond your sort of initial segment. So when you expand to new markets or new segments, it is really critical to stay grounded in a deep understanding of the customer need. And so that's sort of the feedback loop of updating that product market fit narrative when you think about new segments, because you want to think about, if you're talking about a new type of customer, what is their customer need and are you deeply solving it, and potentially taking a test to learn approach to revalidate those assumptions for a new segment. And so in that process, a couple of things here on the slide that you're going to want to think about is, like, 1, what is the customer problem for the new segment? Really grounded in what your customer needs and does the product really get at that? 2, what product adjustments would be required to solve that problem, and how much can you leverage what you've already built? So how adjacent are new segments in terms of what value you can deliver to them? You want to think about how your existing growth levers might work for this new segment. So when we talked about growth hacking and the different viral loops that you might use, you might want to think about how effective can what exists in your product today be for a new user segment? And then what's the right channel to reach them, and what's the right message to put in front of them? So all of those you need to sort of redefine and very intentionally choose who are you going to go after next when you're increasing scale. Second is really crafting your message here. So your message needs to be essentially the simplest articulation of the core value prop. There is sometimes a pull as you're scaling up and while you're addressing new customers and more customers to add complexity and potentially lose focus. But that can be a real misstep, because if you stay crisp in sort of making sure you know that you've got the right message offered in the right channel for the right customer, that keeps you on point in terms of a really clear value proposition that you're articulating back to them. So for example, for us in ad products, the value prop that we might articulate to like a small or medium business who is trying to measure success via engagement or click-through rate or how people are engaging with their product is going to look very different from how we might articulate a value proposition to someone like a large brand advertiser who may be trying to build awareness among a certain audience. Next, in order to continue delivering value to your users in a delightful user experience, your GTM processes really need to scale up along with your user base. So as your product gains traction, you need to move quickly, and streamlining your processes reduces friction so that you can act faster. You can actually adapt to market changes as they're coming along, and you can seize new opportunities when they're in front of you. So a streamlined GTM process ensures that your messaging, marketing campaigns, sales efforts, all of that is basically aligned across regions, across teams, across different customer segments. And all of that consistency is really key to building brand recognition and trust with your users, which also kind of feeds back into supporting scalability. And then lastly, as you grow, resources become more stretched. And so streamlining processes allows you to get the most out of your marketing, sales, and customer success teams without causing burnout or causing problems in terms of their workload. And this is especially important when you're scaling up quickly without increasing your headcount in a linear way. So you'll want to think about streamlining sales enablement to make sure that your sales teams have the right tools and resources. You want to think about also streamlining customer acquisition to make sure you're driving growth. And then lastly, streamlining customer success to drive retention and advocacy. And then lastly, as you scale up and begin to address an additional market or segment, you might also want to think about potential updates to your pricing strategy. That's not always appropriate, but in some cases, like for ad products, for example, when you're expanding to address performance advertisers versus brand advertisers or vice versa, you might want to think about a cost per action versus a cost per impression. And ultimately, all of that is essentially making sure that the way that you're pricing and positioning your product in market is matching up with how your customer is looking to measure their success. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about here, beyond developing your product and then beyond developing your GTM strategy, is ultimately how can you think about structuring your team to support scale? So this includes not just the size of the team, but also how you would drive alignment and collaboration across the teams so that they can operate effectively together, how you would manage stakeholders to set the team up for success in terms of their interactions with those stakeholders, and then ultimately how you would set up all of your team processes to support scale. So diving in, a couple areas to focus on. In the discussion of product discovery, we talked about the importance of having a clear product vision because it pays you dividends in terms of focusing the team and also evaluating trade-offs in your roadmap. But as you're actually entering the growth phase and scaling your product up, that clear product vision is also going to pay dividends back to you in terms of driving alignment across the team as it grows. So the vision should really be clear and inspiring for everyone because it helps people understand the why of what they are doing and the why of what they are working on. And ultimately, the teams that understand the why are going to lean in with more ownership to what they're doing and also just generally make better decisions. And then alongside having a clear vision, you want to set clear, measurable goals to ensure that your team also knows what success looks like. And that can actually align your short-term milestones with your long-term objectives, meaning that your roadmap has focus and accountability as you go along. So alignment isn't just within the product team, but as a product leader, you need to be driving alignment across functions. And so everyone really needs to be moving towards the same outcomes, and having shared goals across the teams and a really strong sense of the why and the where are we going ensures that the teams are really working towards the same metrics and priorities. The second thing to focus on in scaling a team is thinking about how stakeholder management will change. And as your team grows, the number of stakeholders is likely to grow too. So always you want to basically be building strong trust-based relationships with your key stakeholders. And that means really listening to and understanding what they need, clearly communicating trade-offs, and helping them understand the vision and rationale behind the decisions that you're making. That's going to be true no matter what stage your product is in. But as you're scaling it up, you're going to want to be proactive in thinking about which stakeholders are sort of entering the picture, whether it's thinking about new markets or maybe new functions. And you want to get ahead of that by building those really strong relationships with the new stakeholders. The second piece of that is as the product scales, you need to shift towards more of the strategic discussion. So when you're in discovery, you may be in a little bit more of a tactical mode, but as you're growing and as the user base is growing, when talking to stakeholders, you want to make sure that they're aligned on the long-term view and also really understanding what's coming in the roadmap and ensuring that you're addressing their concerns about what's coming in the roadmap at the right level. So it's much more of a strategic discussion. And then lastly, you always want to maintain regular touch points with the stakeholders to make sure that you're managing expectations, that everybody's aligned on what is going on, timelines, outcomes, roadmaps, and then basically involving people early in the decision-making process. Because when you're getting your stakeholders involved in the conversation before decisions are made, you're making better decisions because you're getting more input and you're getting a more diverse perspective of information to take into account. And then you're also getting a sense of buy-in from your partners and a sense of shared ownership across those decisions. And then lastly, as your team grows, you want to leverage your team processes to actually promote efficiency and to really be thoughtful and intentional about the culture that you want to create. So first, regarding flexibility, the processes should be able to evolve because what works for your small kind of scrappy team is not necessarily going to work as you grow. And so you want to build processes that are flexible and have the ability to sort of pivot as conditions change, as your customer segments change, and then as internal structures are kind of shifting around. Then you also want to think about how your team collaborates and executes. And this could involve creating clear frameworks for decision making. Potentially, it's about like defining ownership across different areas and implementing tools that help streamline communication. All of this is essentially setting your team processes up for efficiency and execution. And then lastly, you want to reinforce a culture of transparent communication and collaboration across the teams, which is absolutely critical for your team continuing to be a high performing, high functioning team, even as things are changing quickly and the demands on the team and on the market are growing. So you want to think about how to set up your processes so that your culture is one of knowledge sharing where teams feel both empowered and also encouraged and have the right sort of regular venues to share information and learnings across teams. And that could be through presentations, through documentation, through regular syncs, demos. You can think about what really works for your team and your stage, but essentially you want to be reinforcing and building a collaborative mindset across the team. So overall, scaling the team isn't just about adding resources. It is partly about adding resources, but it is also about fostering that culture of collaboration, having transparency across the teams, and having a really strong alignment on both vision and goals as everything kind of comes back to the strength of your strategy, the strength of your vision, because that's what keeps teams really aligned and in agreement about what they're doing. So in conclusion, today we've talked about setting your team up to scale successfully from the early days of product discovery, the first blush of your opportunity assessment, and then all the way up through scaling your infrastructure and putting in place the team processes that are going to ensure that you can execute efficiently. So I really appreciate you joining me today and hope to see you soon.